I'm a great fan of history. I know not everybody is, but I find some of the connections in history especially fascinating. I appreciate the seminar that we had this morning and some of what I learned about the history of this island of Crete. And there's a saying many of you are probably familiar with. It's from the Spanish writer and philosopher George Santayana. He said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." It's a pretty popular, memorable saying. It's been revised in many different ways. People remember this, but I wanted to use that to start because of some of the history that I want to go through here as I begin my message today. As I said, I find history fascinating because so many of the events of today are shaped by things that have happened in the past. We don't always appreciate that or consider that. And it's a very sad reality that much of mankind's negative history is the same story with just different players and different times. In other words, history does tend to repeat itself, as is highlighted in that quote. The repeating, unfortunately, as well, is due in large degree to human nature. There's an arrogance in human nature that even if we look back in history and we know that if we make certain choices, we want to do certain things that didn't go well the first time around, that we think in our arrogance that we're smarter or we're more capable or we have more resources and we can make it work. But if we pay attention to history, we can also learn from past events so we don't have to repeat those mistakes, so that we can learn what to do instead or what not to do. So let me give you some of this history. In 587 BC, the southern tribes of Israel, that is Judah and Benjamin, were finally and completely taken captive by the Babylonian Empire. This had been a process. There had been two previous invasions. Of course, the northern tribes had gone into captivity more than 100 years earlier. And during this time, the prophet Jeremiah was the primary messenger, if you will, that God was using to warn Judah of the coming captivity, begging them to repent, telling them what would happen if they did not. And the kings of Judah had become increasingly corrupt. King Manasseh had ruled for 43 years, and while he was a decent king at the end, the first half of his reign was just awful. He promoted the worship of Molech, which included child sacrifice, and tradition says that he was the one who had the prophet Isaiah killed. When Manasseh died, he was succeeded by his son Amon, but Amon was so immoral that God only allowed him to reign for 2 years. Amon, before he died, had a son, Josiah. Most of us recognize that name. Josiah was the great-grandson of King Hezekiah, if you are familiar with that genealogy. And as an interesting aside here, if I can interrupt myself, and I can since I'm the one speaking, it's interesting to see how these bloodlines flow, but also how history can change. If Hezekiah had not asked God for the 15 years, Manasseh would have never been born. If Manasseh had not repented in captivity and God allowed him to go back and rule the nation, Amon would have never been born, which means Josiah would have never been born, which means that whole kingly line from that point on would have changed. Josiah, to go back to the account, was only 8 years old when he became king. Can't imagine being king at 8 years old. He was probably advised very greatly by his mother and the priests, but he sought to obey God. He had the heart that his father and his grandfather did not have. And he was the last of the good kings of Judah. Because of Josiah's zeal to obey God, God did not change what he was going to do to the nation, but he did tell Josiah, because of his devotion to him, that he would not punish the nation during Josiah's lifetime. God honored that promise. We touched on that earlier in the feast. Josiah, for whatever reason, decided he needed to fight the king of Egypt, and that history has already been covered. But after Josiah died, there were 4 more kings who reigned over Judah, and their reigns did not last very long because they didn't obey God. There had been previous, as I said, 2 previous deportations as part of the population of Judah was taken to Babylon. One of those first deportations included Daniel and his friends, as we also heard. But Babylon kept absorbing more and more of the territory into the empire until they finally conquered all of Judah. And so, as I said a moment ago, in 587, the whole nation was taken by Babylon completely. and the remnant of most of the people were taken to Babylon. Jeremiah then, in his writings and speaking on God's behalf, had told the nation, submit to this. God said, this is my will, my purpose. I am working this out. And so Babylon was to be a respite, if you will, to reflect and learn from what they had not done. And so he says, go there, take wives, plant vineyards, go on with life and learn, and it will be okay with you. And yet, even in that, most of the people did not understand or follow. During the captivity in Judah and Babylon, as I mentioned, Daniel and Ezekiel were some of the prophets that God spoke through. And in Daniel's writings, it is revealed that God told him the captivity would last 70 years. And so then around 539 or 538, somewhere in there BC, Ezra, Nehemiah, Josiah, Zerubbabel, and many of the people, not all, actually very few, returned to Judah to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. This was accomplished under the Persian rule, because shortly before that, the Persians had conquered the Babylonians. And in conquering the Babylonians, there was a power struggle even in Persia. So Darius I came to the Persian throne, and God gave various ones, as I mentioned, Ezra, Nehemiah, Joshua, and so he gave them favor to go back and be able to accomplish this. So this is around 522 BC. So one of the other prophets during this time was the prophet Haggai. We don't go back to Haggai very often, but Haggai wrote his account around 519. As I mentioned, Zerubbabel was one of the ones. Zerubbabel was actually of the kingly line. He went back to be the governor, or the prefect, if you will, under the Persian rule, to administer that area for the Persians. There's also an interesting aside there that he could not rule as king, even if he had wanted to rule as king, because of the punishment, if you will, that God had said that David's sons eventually would not reign at all. They would not sit on the throne. And so they return. But they're not doing what God had wanted them to do, even in returning. Joshua is the high priest, and he was of that Aaronic line. He was the grandson of Sarai, going back to 2 Kings 7, if you want to look up that genealogy. Sarai was executed by Nebuchadnezzar in one of those deportations. No more is known of that Joshua, but what is also worth mentioning is that Ezra was of the line of Sarai. So we go back to these bloodlines, don't we? How God continues many of these things. And Ezra is a whole different discussion that we won't get into today, but he was an amazing man used by God. Many believe that he was the one that codified, if you will, what we call the Old Testament, collected those books, did some editing, if you will, but a man of God that was very much dedicated to what God had asked him to do. So to go back to the account here, in the initial years when Judah was allowed to return to Jerusalem, very little work was done. Very little work was done to the walls, to the temple. The people came back and they decided to take care of themselves. The temple was still in disarray. The gates of the city were not rebuilt. The walls were not rebuilt. And so this is where Haggai comes back into the picture. And as I mentioned, we don't turn to Haggai very often, even during the feast especially, but there's a connection to these feast days that I want to build on today that's worth noting. This seventh day, the Feast of Tabernacles. And so the title of my message today is simply Haggai's message, the temple. Turn with me, if you will, to Haggai chapter 1. We find here, as we begin the account, as I mentioned, this is the reign of the Persian king, King Darius. And Haggai writes here, in the second year, King Darius, the 6th month, first day of the month, the word of the Eternal came by Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So we have these names mentioned again, all these men that came back as part of this group to reestablish the nation. This is now in the second reign of King Darius. The 6th month reference there is not the reference to the king's reign, but rather to the calendar that we're familiar with as the Jews counted. So this is fall. This is somewhere maybe September, early mid-September. And so then we find as we continue here that God is wanting them to accomplish things. He wants them reestablished, not just as a nation, but he wants them reestablished to once again understand his purpose for them, what he wants them to be in terms of an example and so forth. And so as we continue in verse 2, this is what Haggai says. Thus says the eternal God of hosts, this people says the time is not yet come, the time that the Eternal's house should be built. They were back in the land. They were planting vineyards. They were doing business. They were rebuilding their homes. And so then God asks the question, okay, you say it's not time, verse 3. So then God says through Haggai, verse 4, is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses and the temple to lie in ruins? How much time do you need? You've certainly taken care of yourselves. You've made sure your homes are comfortable, that you have the things that you need. What about the reason I wanted you to go back, to reestablish the city, Jerusalem, and to rebuild the temple for him? And they're not even pondering this. This is not even on their radar. Why would they consider that even reasonable, if you will? So God is asking the question, why have you taken care of those things before honoring me? So hold your place there, but let's go next to 2 Corinthians 6, because I want to tie this into us. You and I are the people of God. We are God's spiritual family. We are to be the example that Israel was to be, and we strive for that. But there's also a different component, not different, additional. There's an additional component connected to these days that we need to remember as well. And so in 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 16, Paul records this. He says, what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. Some of you took the tour before the feast to go through Athens. I've been in other areas of the world where you go to some of these historical places, and the paganism is just entrenched, isn't it? The idols that were worshipped. And this culture in Corinth was certainly part of that. And Paul is reminding them, look, there's no agreement. In the life that you had and the life that God is calling you to, there should be no compromise. There's nothing in agreement. So he continues and he says, as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God and they will be my people. The dwelling aspect is a very interesting thing to ponder this time of year. What are we doing this week? We're certainly keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, but what does tabernacling mean? If you look up the word, it primarily has to do with a dwelling. It's a tent, right? We're tenting with God. We're tabernacling with God. And the reason why God is having us remember this is this verse right here as part of the answer. God has always desired to dwell with mankind, but it has to be dwelling as he is. The nation of Israel had forgotten that, even coming out of captivity. I'm sure they were very excited to no longer be under the thumb of the Babylonians, that they could go home. But many of them didn't even return to Judah. If you count up the numbers, it was about 10% or so. The rest just scattered. And what later became the Roman Empire, they were all over this Mediterranean area and other places. So if we go back to Haggai 1 and verse 5, God then says to the people through Haggai 1 verse 5, he says, consider your ways. So you've built your paneled homes, and my house is still in ruin. So he says, think about that for a moment. Why have you not done what I've asked you to do? To bring it forward and to make it personal, if you will, today, are we part of God's temple being built today? It's easy to be distracted. I'm here as you are. This is an amazing place, and I'm with Mr. Malier. I have prayed for years, this is tongue-in-cheek, I have prayed for years that the place of safety would be in an all-inclusive resort. Right? That's very comfortable. This is a beautiful setting. But when we get comfortable, it's very easy to forget where the focus should be. God is calling us to be part of the temple he is building. He is desiring to tabernacle with us. He's calling us to do that. Are we choosing to be faithful? I'll come back to some of those thoughts here in a little bit. But let's go back. Well, let's continue in verse 6 here. God says again here through Haggai, you have sown much and you bring in little. So they've gone back. They've built their homes, rebuilt their homes. They've replanted their vineyards. They've planted their crops. And God says, look, you've done all this, but yet what is it accomplishing? You eat, and you don't have enough. You drink, you're not filled. You clothe yourselves, but no one's warm. He who earns wages put into bags with holes. And I think most of us could probably relate to that, right? You get your paycheck, and it's like, where does it go? The world as a whole probably feels very similar to that. What is being accomplished? We heard about a little of that in the sermonette. People putting one foot in front of another because they don't know how to do anything else. They just go about life. But God is saying, again, verse 7, consider your ways. Stop and think about it. Right? The definition of an insanity is doing the same thing over and over, thinking you're going to get a different result. So God is saying, look, just pause for a minute. You're planting and it's not producing fruit. You're making wine and it's not satisfying you. You're making money and it disappears. Think about where the disconnect is. I think we need to do the same. They had the vision of going back to the land. The people of Judah had a vision of going back to the land, but they did not have a vision of returning to be a people of God. They were only interested at this point in a better future for themselves. So we see that God wasn't blessing their efforts because they were not considering their ways. He asked them that question or stated that point twice. Consider your ways. Blessings always follow when we honor God first. There's a corollary to that, and that is that understanding always follows obedience. But the rub is we want things to happen humanly. We want things to happen immediately, right? Cause and effect. We do this, we get that, and it's all good. But does any of this mirror where we are as a church? Because if we're going to consider our ways, God recorded those words not just for Israel, but for us as well. And I'm not condemning anything. This is just, we need to reflect on these things. Let me just go back a little bit in our history. In the mid-1990s, and I know many of you, that's not even a memory, that's history for you. The Worldwide Church of God had an attendance, depending on who you ask, numbers between 140 and 150,000 members worldwide. I think many of us would love to see those numbers again. We had an impact in many ways that can be forgotten today. But as a church where we focused on building God's temple, those 140, 150,000 people, were we more focused on building God's temple, or were we more concerned with having a more comfortable future? So then the rubber hits the road, and the questions come up doctrinally. And a lot of people said, I'm not interested in being the temple of God. More than 100,000 members didn't consider their ways and didn't see the need any longer to be part of God's temple that was being built. And so the United Church of God was started out of the ashes of that. But we've had two major splits resulting in us being even about a half the size as we were when we started. Now, numbers aren't necessarily important, are they? God has a pattern of working with small things. So I'm not saying we should be larger numbers. I'm just saying we need to stop and think about some history to remember why things happen. We don't repeat the mistakes. Because God desired for all of Israel, all of the tribes, to be his people, to be the embodiment of living in and living by his law. He wanted a people who would glorify him to the world and show the world what it meant for God to be their God. And so then we come to verse 8. He says here then, "Go up to the mountains and bring wood and build the temple, that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified." God is leading us into his family, isn't he? The whole purpose of why he has called us now is also to be that example, but specifically to be in his family, to be God, children of God. So the glory is his in what we do, in becoming him. And I've spoken to some that are grandparents and great-grandparents, and there's something about that transition in life that you view the grandkids different than your kids. Because now you can have the fun time with them, right? You can spoil them and send them home. But you can also learn from your own mistakes, can't you? When you were too hard or when you were too soft, or the things that were important that should have been done, maybe that you didn't do, you have an opportunity, don't you, to do better. But it should all glorify God, whatever it is that we're doing in life. And this is what God is reminding the nation here. Again, hold your place here, but let's go to Ephesians 5 and verse 25. In this chapter, specifically the latter half or latter part of this chapter, Paul is talking about the roles and the meaning of marriage, why God designed it, why he instituted it. And so as we come then to verse 25, Ephesians 5, Paul reminds husbands to love your wives. Notice how. We go back to the message on Sunday, don't we? Love is one of those words that can be open to all kinds of interpretation and application. But we're told here specifically as husbands how to love our wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. And notice why he did that. Verse 26, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, his word, to glorify himself, but also to glorify her, that we become glorified in the relationship that we have with Jesus Christ. Verse 27, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. Holy and without blemish. If you go back and read the account of what's called Solomon's temple, I consider it David's, right? He put everything in place. Solomon just assembled it. It's a very interesting thing how that was done. It was all done off-site. So the spot in Jerusalem where that temple eventually stood, there was no construction there. All the stones were cut and polished. Everything was fitted together off-site, and then it was simply deassembled, brought to Jerusalem, reassembled. Because we're told that there was no sound of the hammer or chisel in the city. The prep work was done somewhere else. The temple God is building now, the prep work is being done somewhere else, isn't it? Wherever we are, God's people, wherever we happen to be in the world. That prep work is noisy at times, it's messy at times, but it's still becoming something glorious to honor God. So let's go back to Haggai. Haggai 1 and verse 9. He says, you looked for much, but indeed it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. So it wasn't just that they were trying to do these things to satisfy their own needs. It was also because they were doing this, God was not blessing it. He was actually working against them. That's why they weren't prospering, because they weren't honoring him. They weren't glorifying him. So he says, I blew it away. And he says, why? He knew they were going to ask the question, why are you doing that then? They might have gone down a list, but we're keeping the Sabbath and we're doing these other things. And they say, well, why aren't you blessing us? He says, because my house that is in ruins while every one of you runs to his own house. Your focus is wrong. Your focus is not on me. One of my, I have a term I use, local lay people are very familiar with now. One of my personal heresies is that I believe God is at a stage working with his church where I think this is where we are. Why are we not? Well, I'll come back to that. I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's continue the thoughts here. So are we, collectively and individually, more concerned about God being honored by our service to him, or are we concerned with ourselves? It's just a question. I don't have any particulars that I would point to condemn anybody. But it's a question we have to ask based on history. I would think a people coming out of captivity, you would have their attention. And if God says, I want you to go back and rebuild the city, I want you to go back and rebuild the temple, I want you to honor me in what you're doing, I would think they would consider that. But he, again, stated twice, why aren't you? But Haggai is asking some very good questions. He's recording what God is asking, and it's clear that the remnant that had returned had lost the vision of what it meant to be a people of God. So he says, because you're focused on your own comfort, your own needs, I'm not blessing you. So Haggai 1 and verse 10. God says, therefore, the heavens above you withhold the dew, the earth withholds its fruit. I have called for a drought on the land and the mountains, on the grain and the wine and the new oil, whatever the ground brings forth, on men and livestock, all the labor of your hands. So if you're not going to honor me, he says, I'm going to withhold the blessings. So I'm not saying that God's church is ignoring God as Judah was doing here, that Haggai is addressing, but again, looking at history, so we don't repeat, especially the wrong lessons. Why are we not being blessed more as a church? We could look at any number of things, right? We could look at attendance. We could look at income. Both of those are actually fairly decent compared to some years ago. Why are our media efforts not being blessed? Media department certainly spends a great deal of effort and time and energy and focus putting out that message, and yet you have evangelical Christians that can put out a 5-minute video and get, 3 million views in a week. I think part of the answer is that we're deep in a world that has no interest in listening to God. Certainly not the truth. To feel good or to think that whatever choices they make are acceptable, there's a potential we as a church could be focused on the wrong things. I don't know that we are. Maybe we're missing something. But perhaps, and I mentioned this earlier, maybe we should give more focus to building God's temple. So in verse 12, God has said all of this to the people through Haggai. And so it says, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, and the remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the eternal their God. They didn't resist. They didn't push back. They didn't dig their heels in. They said, but, whatever, and excuses and whatever else they put forward. They stopped. They listened to God. They considered their ways. And it says they obeyed the voice of the eternal their God and the words of Haggai the prophet. And as the eternal their God had sent them, the people feared the presence of the eternal. That word is very interesting there. Can certainly mean to be afraid of. But it can also mean, depending on the context, and I think this fits the context better, it can mean to revere in terms of honoring. The people saw the lack of honor they had to God, and they collectively decided to change that. What happened once that happened? Verse 13. Then Haggai, the Eternal's messenger, spoke the Eternal's message to the people, saying, I am with you, says the Eternal. So it's not just a matter of God correcting them. When they begin to show a positive response, he says, okay, I'm going to be with you. And that should always be a source of encouragement to us wherever we are in life. Because it's not always evident, is it? It's not always clear to us. We don't always understand the lessons of the trials that we're in the middle of. We don't always see the vision of where God is leading us to. I know in my life, I could say at least 15 years, I had no idea where God was directing me. But then after the fact, it was as if I was handed a map and saw clearly what he was doing. The point is they responded. They collectively decided to respond. And so in verse 14, it says, the Eternal stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people, everyone. He stirred up their spirit. And they came and they worked on the house of the Eternal of hosts, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. They had stalled for a while, but within a very short time of being directed, they responded. Nehemiah's temple, as it's commonly called, the second temple that was built, was probably completed around 516 BC. So this would have been roughly about 20 years after their return from captivity. It took them 20 years to get to this point. But once they responded, God gave them great encouragement. If you go back and read the account in Nehemiah, it took them less than 3 months to rebuild the wall. Once they had it in their mind to do it, it was done. Again, hold your place here, but let's go to Hebrews 13. Hebrews 13 and in verse 5, we have this encouragement. Let your conduct be without covetousness. What you and I do should never depend on what we think we should have that somebody else has. Right? My salvation, your salvation doesn't depend on what somebody else has or does. Our conduct should be according to God's law. So he says, be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, and this is the promise, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So even in Judah's captivity for 70 years, it might have seemed that God had forsaken them, but he had not. All that he'd given Daniel in terms of the visions and the understandings that he had, the people took with them. Ezra, as part of those that came out of captivity, codifying the books of what we call the Old Testament, so they would have that law before them. God never left them. And even in the midst of our worst trials, it may seem at times that God has left us, but this is the promise. The corollary, if we want to flip it around, is that we have to be careful that we never leave or forsake God. And that's part of what he's hoping that Judah would see, and I'm sure that's part of what he wants to see in us. Will we be faithful? Will we honor him in all that we do? So let's go back to Nehemiah. And this account is very interesting, Nehemiah 8, because we have what is not in Haggai in terms of the response of the people. We know they responded. We know that they rebuilt the temple. We know that they rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem, put the gates up again, and began to do those things that God had asked them to do. And so in Nehemiah 8, the whole chapter, we have a similar time period as we are in this week. And Ezra stands up in verse 1 here, Nehemiah 8, and he reads the law to the people. And this is, in a practical sense, why we do some of the things we do. Right? The minister stands on a stage behind a lectern, reads from God's law to the people. This is similar to what Ezra is doing here. So verse 2, he brings it out before the whole assembly. Notice the timing. First day of the 7th month. It's the Feast of Trumpets, isn't it? The fall holy days begin to refocus the people. So he reads, verse 8, he reads from the law. He stands on this podium in verse 8. In verse 5, in sight of all the people, all that gathered. And so verse 6, Ezra blessed the eternal, the great God, and the people said, Amen. I agree. Let it be. They bowed their heads. They worshiped the eternal with their faces to the ground. In verse 8, so they read distinctly from the book that God gave them the sense. He gave them understanding to help them. And so they're heartbroken, which is a very positive thing, because they realized they had been drifting for some time. They had not been focused the way they should have been. And they're very sad. And so Nehemiah steps in. He says, "This day is holy to the eternal your God. Do not mourn or weep." For all the people wept as they heard the words of the law. They realized their culpability, their ownership of what should have been. And so then the rest of the Levites in verse 11 says they quieted the people and they said, "Be still, for the day is holy." And then Nehemiah encourages them to go out and eat and drink and send portions and rejoice greatly because of what's pictured in these days. The restoration, even for the nation at that time, what was pictured in these days. And so then the Feast of Booths is celebrated this week. Feast of Tabernacles, verse 13. The heads of the fathers of the houses of all the people, priests and Levites, they gathered together to further understand the words of the law. And they found written in the law, which the Eternal had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the seventh day. They had even forgotten that. That it should be proclaimed and announced in all the cities and in Jerusalem to go out to the mountains and bring these olive branches and oil trees and myrtle branches and palm branches to make these booths, these tabernacles. Verse 16, so they did. They went out and they did this. They made themselves booths on the roofs of the houses, in the courtyards, in the court of the house of God, the courtyard, the outer courtyard near the temple. They made booths and they sat under them. Notice this, verse 17. For since the day of Joshua the son of Nun until that day, the children of Israel had not done so. So it wasn't just those coming out of captivity. For almost 1,000 years they had drifted. Is God a God of mercy and patience? He certainly is. And probably one of the many understatements in Scripture, the end of verse 17, and there was very great gladness. A vision of purpose, an understanding of what God was doing, and a humility to be part of it. And so they kept it. Verse 18, they read every day from the book of the law for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, there was a sacred assembly. That's what we've done. We're on this 7th day, aren't we? We're following God's instruction as we're told to do. And God is blessing us. Again, I highlight some of the things that we might want to consider, but I'm not condemning anything that we're doing as a church. Mr. Sheeby highlighted some of those things in his message. You know, the depth of unity that we have now, we might be a fraction of what we were in worldwide. But my history in God's church goes back to 1968. And I don't see that church ever having the same kind of unity that we have now. The same kind of love that we have now. Real, godly love that we have now. The sense of purpose that we have now. And the focus. And even kind of a sub-theme going through this week, the understanding of family. And I've talked with several here, and you talk about the connections that you have through marriages of your children, of who you married, who their children marry. You know, just we're really just one big family, aren't we? 6 degrees of separation. If you poke hard enough, we're probably related in some way through marriage or other things to just about everybody in the church. And that's a wonderful thing. The tightness and the unity. Maybe all that preparation is for something big that God is going to do with us and through us, like he did with these people. It's worth considering, especially during this week. So let's go back to Haggai. Haggai 2. God corrected the people. He told them why he wasn't blessing them. He asked them to consider their ways, and to their credit, they did. They responded. We read in Nehemiah then that they were just so hungry to drink up God's word. They stood before the podium as Ezra and others read from the book of the law, and they were moved in the right way. They were deeply humbled by what they were hearing. And so then we come to Haggai 2 and verse 1. It says, in the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month. What day is that? It's today. All right, it's the 7th day of the feast. The word of the Eternal came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people, and say to them. So this is about 90 years down the road after the Babylonian captivity and the temple was destroyed. There were some people that were very young, you that are teenagers, especially younger teenagers. Fast forward 70, 90 years, right? What would you remember from this time? And yet there were some, God asked the question, who is left among you who saw the temple, this temple, in its former glory? So they had built the temple, and by all accounts, it was nothing like Solomon's temple in scope and in grandeur. But it was the temple again. He says, is this not in your eyes as nothing? Right? What you have now, if it were behind me, he would say, is this but nothing in your memory compared to what was? And yet he says, be strong. Be strong, Zerubbabel. Be strong, Joshua. Be strong, all of you people, says the Eternal, and work. Work. We heard about that too, didn't we? We're not just sitting and listening. That's a really big part. But then what do we do? Work, he says, for I am with you, says the Eternal of hosts. Go on and do bigger things, if you will. These days picture a launch pad, don't they? What are we going to do over the winter? Till next year, we once again repeat the cycle of holy days, starting with Passover. It's easy to sit. I'm in southwest central, or southeast central Wisconsin. I don't like being outside in the winter. It's not where I grew up. I still lament the whole thing, and I get sad, literally. I have 5,000 Kelvin light bulbs in my lamp desks because the lack of light affects me. But I try to stay active because I need to, don't I? You can't only sit so long. What are we going to do in the coming months with what we've learned this week, with what we've learned this past year in terms of the holy days that we've been a part of, the Sabbath messages that we've listened to? Do a work. Let's go next to 1 Corinthians 3. 1 Corinthians 3, and in verse 10 we'll begin. Paul says, according to the grace of God which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation. Right, Paul says, as your minister, your pastor, as the role that God has given me to Paul as an apostle, he says, I've laid the foundation. I've laid the groundwork. But he says, another builds on it. Let each one take heed how he builds on it. What kind of temple are you building? Not collectively with anyone else. What are you contributing? What are each of us doing to be part of that temple? What are we building on? Because verse 11 tells us, no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Right? If we don't build on the right foundation, it doesn't matter how pretty it is, doesn't matter how functional it is, doesn't matter how much we think it is the wonderful thing. If it's not built on the right foundation, it is not going to end well. So he says in verse 12, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold or silver or precious stones or wood or hay or straw, each one's work will become clear. Time reveals it, doesn't it? This is why God, I believe, why God asks us to bear fruit. Fruit takes time, doesn't it? In the springtime, we have a few fruit trees. You can see all the flowers. And you can ponder what kind of harvest you will have, whether it's the pears or the apples or whatever else. And sometimes it bears out, and sometimes it doesn't. But you only know after months, don't you? God is patient, as I mentioned earlier. But we have to build. We have to be part of the work. Verse 13, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work what sort it is. To be revealed at the core, all the extraneous stuff will be stripped away, and we'll be left with what is of value. Let's go to Hebrews 3 next. Hebrews 3 and in verse 1 says, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Jesus Christ, who was faithful to him who appointed him. Even Jesus Christ was a faithful servant. We read in other places in Hebrews that he learned through obedience. The Son of God learned through obedience things deeper than he would have understood any other way. Verse 2, was faithful to him who appointed him. Verse 3, for this one has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who built the house has more honor than the house. He who built the house. Christ is building his temple. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. But God works with people, doesn't he? He works with us. He works with those he's called out. And so then verse 5, Moses indeed was faithful in all of his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which would be spoken of afterward. But Christ as son over his own house, whose house we are. We are the temple of God. Whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. Now, I'm no one special. I know that. God, what he has done through me is simply because of his purpose. But when I grew up, I mentioned going back to 1968, attended in Cincinnati, had just gone to an AM/PM church. They'd grown enough. Before that, they were traveling up to Indianapolis with no highways. The church then, in the early 70s, just exploded in attendance. Starting in the late 60s, to the point that when I left for Ambassador College in 1982, there were over 2,200 people meeting on a holy day. We had to rent, at that time, there weren't a lot of options. We had to rent the convention center in Cincinnati to hold holy day services. Fast forward to today, if I go back to Cincinnati, which I do occasionally, there are only 2 individuals that I can think of that still attend in Cincinnati that I grew up with. For a lot of people, the vision disappeared. They didn't see their place in the temple. They didn't value what God was offering. We're reminded of these things in these verses. God is building a temple. He's doing a marvelous thing. Let's go to chapter 8 here in Hebrews. Hebrews 8 and verse 2. This chapter is talking about Jesus Christ as our high priest of a better covenant. The flaw, if you will, of the old covenant was that it did not promise eternal life. Right? That was the curse of the law. That was discussed earlier in the feast. The curse of the law was death. Because if you abrogated, if you violated that covenant at any point, right, the death penalty was there. The sacrifices temporarily removed that, but it didn't remove it, as we can read even here in Hebrews, didn't remove it permanently. That's the difference with what we have now. So Hebrews 8 and verse 2 is breaking a little bit into the thought here. It says, Jesus Christ is a minister of the sanctuary, notice, and of the true tabernacle which the Eternal erected, not man. It can be easy, to go back to my earlier thought, it can be easy for us at times, as a weakness humanly, to think we've built stuff. I went on from attending Ambassador College in Big Sandy, Texas, to going to Pasadena, and the auditorium that was there and the money that was put into that, and where is that for us today? It was a beautiful building, served great purpose. But once God's blessing was off what the church was doing, it's just another building, isn't it? And yet Christ here is being referred to as the one of the true sanctuary, which God is building. It's not by man's hands. We're part of it by supporting what God is doing, by glorifying what God is doing, by obeying him, by humbling ourselves in service to him. So let's begin to wrap all of this up. A couple of more verses, but let's go to Revelation 21. Revelation 21 is after the fulfillment of these days, this Feast of Tabernacle, the millennial reign of Jesus Christ, and it's after the last great day, the eighth great day, when all of the rest of humanity that has ever lived and died will have opportunity to know why they existed, what God's purpose is for them, and to understand the meaning of life. Then God erases all of that. It's not that it was not without purpose. It just was temporary. Like these tabernacles in the past were temporary. Like many of the things we even do today are temporary. They're not the end of it all. It's just a way to help us remain focused, to be there. And so then God himself, the Father, comes down to dwell. The new heaven and the new earth that's mentioned here in this chapter. We won't read the whole thing. I just want to highlight verse 3. Revelation 21, verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. The tenting of God is with men, the dwelling. God will personally dwell with mankind. They shall be his people. That's the point of tabernacling, to become his. God himself will be with them and will be their God. And then I would suspect, and we have no clue what this would mean, what happens afterwards, but I think things will get really exciting then. Because we will finally be to the point of what God wants to do with his family. Right now we're becoming his family. But we'll be doing. My mom was a music teacher, taught piano. I have 4 brothers. I was the great disappointment. She could not teach me piano. I don't know why. I could not wrap my head around it. I found a little cartoon once. I glued to a piece of wood and varnished over top of it. The little boy sitting at a piano saying to his teacher, if God had wanted me to play the piano, he would have given me 88 fingers. We're not all the same, but still, we're part of the family, aren't we? If we were all the same, we would get on each other's nerves too much. But God is building something here, isn't he? He's desiring. This has, what we read here in Revelation 21:3 has been the desire of God from before he did anything to create what we're aware of. The spiritual realm, the physical realm, you and me, everything. God himself will be with them and be their God, and he will dwell with them. That's why he's done all of this. That's his purpose. His patience with us is so that he can accomplish that. We can choose to dwell with him, or we can choose not to. This week has pictured dwelling with him. Again, the word there in Revelation 21:3 about dwelling is very similar to the word tabernacling. We could read it in this way: he will tabernacle with them. This is what Israel didn't capture. This is the vision they didn't see originally. This is what they lost sight of as they drifted more into immorality, and they became the nations that God had driven out before them. They lost that picture, and they stopped considering the building, the temple that they were supposed to be a part of. Are we engaged in doing our part in building God's temple where he will dwell? Will we glorify God in building that temple? Let's go back and finish in Haggai 2. Haggai 2. We read verse 4 where he encourages Zerubbabel and the others to be strong. He says, I am with you. Verse 5, then he says, according to the word that I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, so my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. He said, I haven't moved. I'm still where you said you would be with me. My desire is still to bless you. My desire is still to use you as my people, to show the world. My desire has never changed. He says, so my spirit remains among you. I have not forsaken you, Hebrews. For thus, verse 6, thus says the Eternal of hosts, once more, it is a little while, I will shake the heaven and the earth and the sea and the dry land. This has not happened yet. I will shake all nations, and they shall come to the desire of all nations. They don't know it yet. The world doesn't know it yet, but their desire is what God is accomplishing through his Son. The desire of all nations is Jesus Christ. To have his spirit, his mind, to understand his character and to be like him. He says, I will fill this temple with glory. He was not speaking about Nehemiah's temple. If you go back and read the accounts about the tabernacle in the wilderness and you read the account about Solomon's temple, God's presence filled those buildings, those tabernacles. It's called the Shekinah glory. God's glory never descended on Nehemiah's temple. So he was not talking about that temple. What was he talking about? To use a simple illustration, he's pointing a finger and he says, this temple. I will build this temple. The glory of this latter temple. And then he makes almost what seems like an odd transition. Verse 8, the silver is mine, the gold is mine, says the Eternal of hosts. What's that got to do with anything? Nehemiah's temple didn't have those things. The glory of Solomon's temple, go back and read the amount of gold and the silver and the carvings and all that was done, all the materials that were used. It was truly amazing by all accounts. The stone that was used was so polished, the limestone, so that when the sun hit it, they said you could see it for miles away, like reflecting off a mirror. This was not Nehemiah's temple. God's saying, don't worry about those things. I own it all. And the temple I'm going to build, I'll bring the stuff. I'll bring the materials. I'll make it the way it needs to be. Because he says, verse 9, the glory of this latter temple, the glory of this latter temple shall be greater than the former. The people are more important than the building. But the people of God are the temple. They'll be greater than the former, says the Eternal of hosts. And in this place I will give you peace. Now, we touched on that even this morning, didn't we? Peace to know that you're not going to lose your house, your job, that your money could disappear in a moment, that your health could disappear in a moment, your life could literally change in a moment, as unfortunately happened with the Gryders this week. To have the peace to know I don't have to worry about anything. No worry. Can you imagine not worrying? Whatever you worry about. I will give peace, says the Eternal of hosts. The Feast of Tabernacle in fulfillment is not for us. If we remain faithful, we're spirit in God's family. We're spirit beings, right? So this fulfillment of these days is not for us. We're the first fruits. But we will be working with Jesus Christ to teach the nations that live into the millennial period. The priests, the teachers of the law, the ministers, the servants that will go out with Christ through his direction, and we will serve the nations to show them what life is like, what it should be based on, how to have happy marriages and families we heard about earlier as well. Like Haggai and so many other prophets will be directing the people to God, to honor, to glorify, to obey him. Are we preparing now for that work? It's not just down the road. If we're waiting for it to be down the road, we won't be ready. What are we learning now in serving God and his kingdom? What are we putting into place for our character to become like him? To be that latter temple in which Christ truly dwells. As we leave these days, the Feast of Tabernacles, let us remember to take the lessons of these days home with us, to bring it forward in the coming year, to make it truly part of us. May we become the temple he desires to live in. May we glorify him in all that we do. May we be always strong in the eternal.